So for those joining us, I am Sarah Jack, the Director of the research platform Sustainable Business Development through Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and also Professor at the Department of Entrepreneurship, Innovation and Technology at Stockholm School of Economics. So this afternoon's lineup starts with Professor Elke Weber, a Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs from Princeton University, where she also founded the Behavioural Science for Policy Lab. Professor Weber is also the Gerhard R. Andlinger Professor in Energy and the Environment, and in 2020 Professor Weber was named a member of the National Academy of Sciences in recognition of her distinguished and continuing achievements in original research. At Columbia University, she founded the Centre for Decision Sciences and Centre for Research on Environmental Decisions, which is still very active today. And Professor Weber also collaborates with the Stockholm Resilience Centre and is serving on the SRC's Science Advisory Council. She also works with the Bezier Institute for Ecological Economics and has been participating in at least the last three ASCO meetings. And Professor Weber joins us from New York to deliver her talk on decision making in complex realities. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Weber. So I'll now hand it over to you, Elke. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your very kind introduction. And let me share my screen so we can look at the slides. So I want to tell you a little bit about my work on sustainability as a psychologist. And as we all know, there are many challenges to sustainability on our planet. There are deep uncertainties about the science, about social responses. There are threats of tipping points, positive and negative ones. Collective action and common pool resource management issues are wide. Informational obstacles exist, but also cognitive and motivational deficits, some of which I will tell you about. And there are multiple and diverse actors and stakeholders. We have different types of agents, from individuals to households, corporations, NGOs, governmental organizations. They all have different goals, they have different time horizons, different sources of power and amounts of power. Trust plays an issue, information plays a role. And there's intra and intergenerational equity and justice considerations to be concerned about. So let me give you a roadmap to my talk for the next 40 minutes. I will first tell you about some differences between Homo sapiens versus Homo economicus as a decision maker. Then we will talk more broadly about human behavior and cognition in a social and physical context, and about a project in conjunction with the Stockholm Resilience Center on that. And I will end with some data on a tale of two cities, in particular, COVID and climate change. So we all know that we live in a time period that has been called the Anthropocene, and that is to denote the fact that it is human behavior that, in particular behavior with respect to energy and energy technologies, energy extraction, that is currently changing and influencing our environment. And the ruling assumption in policy circles is that these decisions are made rationally. Human perception, comprehension, and choice are made by rational updating, rational choice. Homo economicus makes these decisions, and that perceptions and comprehensions made by humans, are mostly considered ex post. When things aren't working, when people aren't responding the way we expected them to respond. And it's telling that it took until the fifth version of the IPCC assessment report, the fifth assessment report in 2014, that we first even mentioned non-rational decision processes within that forum. And so what I want to talk about next is, first of all, how do all people differ from Homo economicus? How is the species of Homo sapiens different from what we model in rational expectations? And then also how to talk a little bit about how decision makers differ from each other, and talk about the role of individual differences and cultural differences. So what should we all know about Homo sapiens? This is just a subset, but the most important insight probably is that we are subject, Homo sapiens, we are subject to finite attention and finite processing capacity. Herb Simon talked about this 50, 60 years ago. And query theory, a theory by myself and Eric Johnson, has been trying to operationalize what that means when it comes to making decisions, and how this finite attention and processing capacity in our human adaptation to that give rise to cognitive myopia and to status quo bias. And so the basic assumption of query theory is that when you're given a choice between doing something that is sustainable but costly right now, as opposed to something that might be unsustainable but easier in the current moment, that we discuss or consider our choice options sequentially. And the first option that we consider has a sizable advantage. And yes, so the image, the ambiguous image on the bottom right side of my slide basically makes that point for perception. You can look at the figure and you can see the white candlestick in the middle. Or you can see the two children looking at each other. If black becomes foreground for you, you can actually switch back and forth between these two percepts, but you can't really see them both at the same time. And so the notion is that we also do this for our decisions. We think what's good about option A, what's good about option B. We might switch back and forth. But as we first think about what's good about option A, and absolutely automatic and implicitly, you don't necessarily are conscious of that, we inhibit all arguments for all other response competitors, because we first want to figure out what's good about option A. Then we turn to option B and consider it, prime and query its advantages. But because these advantages were previously inhibited, they have a harder time coming to the surface. So all other things being equal, the first option considered has a sizable advantage. And of course, that makes the question, what options gets considered first, the million-dollar question, because it has that query theory advantage. One important answer to that question is the status quo. We tend to first think about what's good about doing things the way we're doing them right now, or the way things have been recommended to us. And that makes perfect sense. But it also is one of the contributors to status quo bias. It also turns out that it matters how an option is presented to you, how it's packaged. And a few years ago, I was wondering why Americans were so opposed to a carbon tax. And at the same time, we're actually buying these carbon offsets, sort of at increasing rates. That you can buy to offset your carbon emissions when you travel around the country. So here's an example of a question that we asked people on an online survey, a representative sample of Americans on an online survey. Do you want to buy this airline ticket that includes a carbon user fee for a certain amount of money, or do you want to buy the ticket without the user fee? And then we had 2 pages of text that explained why the user fee was called was worth $7.70, how it was going to be used, identical for everyone. But the big difference between 2 groups of people was one group had the user fee being described as a carbon tax, and the other one as a carbon offset. And the question is it something about the words that triggers differences in uptake? And so let me show you the results. When the user fee was described as an offset, you can see that people who self-identified as Democrats or independents or Republicans, and we did this after the experiment, and basically 62% bought the inclusive ticket that was a user fee, and it didn't matter what their political affiliation was. The same question with just the single word different, carbon tax. It didn't matter to the Democrats, but it mattered tremendously to the Republicans. Uptake went down to 27.5%. And we basically we can show, and we did show in this experiment, that it's query theory processes, which option people consider first by looking at it by eye movements or by process tracing methods that determines people's preferences. Here's another factum about Homo sapiens. We have many goals and oftentimes conflicting goals. We do have the goals of Homo economicus, self-regarding material goals, but we also have other focused goals. We do care about the well-being of others, but also we have psychological goals. Turns out that only active goals play a role in a decision. So which of course then gives rise to sometimes conflicting decisions because different roles get activated in different contexts. And so when it comes to sustainability, it's important to prime those goals that relate to sustainability in a given context by physical, social, or other interventions. Another thing we know from prospect theory, for which Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002, is that we evaluate outcomes in a relative fashion. And if we evaluate something to a lower reference point and we think we're evaluating gains, we are more risk averse. When we're evaluating relative losses, we are more risk seeking and losses loom larger. So an important consideration is compared to what? If you present people with outcomes of options, they will either infer their own reference points, or you can guide them to use different reference points, and it makes a difference for their decision. Decisions are malleable in multiple ways. We also, Homo sapiens learns best by trial and error learning, getting hurt. And personal experience, seeing as believing, plays a large role. At the same time, we are committed to our convictions. We are tribal. We need to know that we belong to certain communities who have their own rules of conduct. And oftentimes, sort of putting on those glasses, those lenses, of how our community sees things influences what we see. We do not live in the same physical reality, because believing is seeing. And then lastly, I want to tell you something about multiple modes by which we make decisions. We make decisions based on calculation, based on emotions, based on our social role. And many successful conservation NGOs like REA, for example, have been using these emotional and social processes for a long time. But just to show you a study where we looked at the influence of these decision modes. On one hand, affect-based decisions, where we use immediate emotional reactions and gut feelings to guide our choices, or calculation-based decisions where we weigh costs and benefits, either in some normative or in some shortcut way, or role-based decisions where we use our social identity to infer rules of which option we should consider. How these different decision modes guide energy decisions. And so many utilities around the world are trying to get their customers, on the one hand, to buy green power, switch to green power scenarios. Oftentimes they're still at this point in time somewhat more expensive, or to switch to different time of use plans. And so in this study, we actually sort of asked customers of both a Swiss and a California utility to make decisions between a standard power option that involved brown electricity and had a certain price target, a ticket, or a green power option that was based on renewables, but was somewhat more expensive. And they chose between those. The options were described in greater detail, the way the utilities typically do this. And as you can see in the results, in both countries, green power was the majority choice. Green power is quite popular, even in the United States, across political spectrum. But then after people made their decision, we also asked them to indicate to what extent they had used each of these different decision modes, to thinking about it in terms of costs and benefits, money and consequences, or making these decisions based on feelings and emotions, or making this decision based on sort of a social identity and what somebody in that social identity would do. And as you can see from looking at the regression coefficients that tell us how choices of the green option increased or decreased as a function of people using the calculation mode based, the calculation-based mode more. Basically, uptake of the green option went down, significantly down, but increased use of an emotion-based mode or a role and rule-based mode significantly increased the uptake of the green electricity option. So the implication of that is that we shouldn't just give people information about costs and benefits in dollars and cents, but we also, when we communicate these choices, use images and use information that primes decision modes that take advantage of our social identity and of our pride in being part of the solution. All right, let me switch and say a little bit about why we should incorporate more realistic assumptions about human actors, why we should worry about the processes and goals that Homo sapiens brings to the table, as opposed to sticking with the simpler and much more easily implemented goals and processes of Homo economicus. There have been an increasing number of studies and papers that document that thinking about decisions in their full human complexity increases uncertainty. Brian Beckett and colleagues in the bottom right slide of a paper on my screen basically showed last year that increasing our assumptions about human choice complexity introduces just as much uncertainty about predicting 2100 global temperatures as the uncertainty, the scientific uncertainty we have about the climate system. And so it is getting then harder to predict what will happen when we intervene in certain ways, when we impose certain policies, when we impose a carbon tax of a certain amount. So it is a complication of sorts. At the same time, it's also an opportunity in the sense that these broader theories can explain status quo bias and other barriers to change that currently are really puzzling us. You know, we might have the technology in place, you know, to move to a sustainable future, but are politicians willing to implement, you know, to pass legislation that will mandate these technologies? Will people embrace them? You know, will the uptake be rapid enough to bring about the change we need in the next couple of decades? And so understanding why we have these hesitations to act, why these barriers to change exist, yeah, is very useful, because it also, if these theories are causal theories, and we always strive to develop causal evidence, you know, for these processes, it increases entry points for behavior change. It's no longer just a question of changing prices or mandating, you know, or taking certain options off the table, but we have many more options for behavior change. And so therefore we can actually improve the uptake of supply side solutions. There's so many psychological processes, psychological phenomena, psychological biases, that sometimes it seems overwhelming to move away from Homo economicus, where things are not necessarily simple, but more straightforward, because there's a grounding, unified theory of human behavior, to these more psychological theories. The different attempts to help people with embracing this greater complexity. And 3 years ago, I got together a panel of, I think, 20 psychologists and behavioral economists, where we summarized the tools that policymakers, you know, or other agents have at their disposal to change people's energy and environmental related decisions. And we classified them by the objectives that they can satisfy. Given that we have finite attention, attention is scarce, so we have to get people's attention away from other issues they might be paying more attention to. How to engage people's desire to contribute to the social good. How to facilitate a more accurate assessment of risks and costs and benefits, and how to make complex information more accessible, easier to use. But there are other approaches. And I want to tell you a little bit more about an approach that we developed together with Maya Schluter at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And the paper just came out a few months ago. But here we look at human behavior and cognition in context, in a social and physical context. It built on work that Maya and colleagues already had developed beforehand. But yeah, sort of bringing myself and Sarah Constantino, my postdoc, also a psychologist, cognitive psychologist, to the table, allowed us to make this view of human information processing larger and broader and more complex. And so there is different components. People perceive information that gets filtered, as we said, you know, oftentimes through their ideological lenses. They pay attention to a subset of what they can perceive. Situational characteristics I elicited that are subset of the stable characteristics of goals, of values, of norms, of emotions, of other assets. And those situational characteristics and incoming information get combined in evaluation of choice options. Then we make a decision, then we act. The behavior goes back out into the social and biophysical environment, changes it, shapes it, and then sort of we recycle with that. On top of that, external information comes in from the social and biophysical environment. So, of course, individuals are not acting in a vacuum. Individuals are components in social networks where they interact with each other and with also ecological actors. So what happens when we have this large list of theories that tell us something about these different components of information processing. So we took a survey of theories from different areas, psychological theories that had come out of the notion of constraints, that we are only boundedly rational in how we as human information processors deal with that constraint of bounded rationality. We looked at theories that incorporated the physical and social context of the decision maker at any given point in time. Theories that incorporated dynamics of choice, and also theories that embrace the multiplicity of goals and the multiplicity of processes that we bring to the table. This gets us a relatively long list of theories that we can now basically score with respect to whether or not they are relevant for perception. So prospect theory, for example, clearly influences our perception. It related to reference points, for example, and how we evaluate options are different from expected utility, and also stable characteristics, sort of, for example, the degree of loss aversion that somebody exhibits. So we can score these different theories with respect to the components of information processing that they influence and describe in different ways. Then the question is, well, how do we use this kind of framework? How do we use this table, this matrix, and the associated figures? There might be sort of two ways in which you want to use it. One of them is for a given phenomenon that you're trying to understand, because maybe you've encountered an anomaly. People aren't acting the way rational choice would predict they do. You want to find now additional relevant theories that explain this anomaly. And when you do that, you might find that there actually are multiple theories that explain the phenomenon. Now you want to compare those theories and see how they differ from each other and which one makes a better additional prediction. And so, for example, for cooperation in a threshold public goods situation in fisheries, you might find that your fishers are not abiding to rational choice predictions. And then the question is, well, what's relevant in terms of information processing in this context? Well, they might perceive the options in different ways. And they might evaluate these options in ways that differs from rational choice. And they are very much influenced by their social and biophysical environment, because you find that sort of fisheries in different cultural contexts, for example, act in different ways. Well, if those are your three components, social, biophysical environment, valuation, and perception, that you think might be driving the behavior that you're interested in, then you can go to your matrix and say, okay, here are my three columns that I'm interested in. Which of the theories on my list in those rows actually touches on all three? And you find that it's theories around psychological risk dimensions, social norms, and also trust and reciprocity. And then now you can sort of basically go and see to what extent theories in these three different domains explain the behavior. Maybe each one has a role to play and they can be put together, or maybe they are competitors to each other. But it constrains for you the set of theories in this large field of human psychology and decision theory that you otherwise wouldn't even know how to approach. So let me summarize the project HUB-CC, Human Behavior and Context, and what it buys us. And so what I want to argue is that understanding the full range of human goals, human objectives, and decision processes helps us with the following in the following ways. It's an asset that can explain many existing puzzles, what the economists call anomalies, because they are not what rational choice would predict. It does allow for the design of decision environments that can help us avoid the pitfalls of bounded rationality, that instead actually capitalize on its strengths. And I sometimes use the metaphor of psychological jujitsu. Just as in a combat situation, you can basically turn around the forces that might hurt you in a way that sort of defends you against damage. So we can actually take our theories, query theory, for example, that tells us why sometimes we find that there is status quo bias, and redesign this decision environment in a way that the processes that come natural and automatic to us and guide our decisions as adaptation to bounded rationality actually do lead us to the decision that with which we are happy in the long run, that has the highest utility for us in the long run. So in that sense, the causal theories lead to the redesign of choices, and people sometimes talk about that as choice architecture. Of course, nudges that you sometimes hear about are just a very, very small component of one of the tools in this large tool bag of choice architecture. In addition, understanding this broad range of human goals and objectives also provides us with tools in situations where economic or legal tools might be hard to implement. So, it might be hard to pass a carbon tax, and there's, backlash against other mandates. Banking on these behavioral interventions might be a way of dealing with demand side solutions. But on top of that, there are also these behavioral interventions, choice architecture, are ways of implementing those other tools, economic or legal tools, in ways that are more effective. A certain benefit, a certain subsidy being given at time of purchase might have a different effect than the same subsidy given at the time of filing your taxes, for example. And psychological theory will tell you why and which way of implementing these legal or economic tools will be more effective. And this way we can overcome status quo bias, present bias, we can prime longer time horizons. We can use positive emotions, a sense of pride, or at certain points in time, negative emotions, anger. Anger is better than fear strategically. We can use tribal identities to create appropriate social norms. We can use people's social needs and social emotions to enforce these norms. We can embrace differences in values as necessary requirements for win-win solutions. There's future direction to our HubCC project. Clearly, the theories that the four authors, co-authors of this paper identified are still just a subset of important behavioral contributions. So we very much think about this framework as a living document and to be crowdsourced. And so we have a website where authors can actually add, members of the community can add additional theories or examples of how these theories have been helpful in applied contexts. And so I will direct you to that website again in one of my last slides. Okay, so let me switch now to the third part of my talk and talk about a tale of two crises, in particular COVID-19 and climate change. And as I've argued elsewhere, both of those are global issues that require international cooperation. They require rapid governmental responses because both of these crises are moving at an exponential rate. They require behavior change at all levels, not just citizens, but at all levels, corporate responses, policymaker responses. And they all have upfront costs that will avoid negative future outcomes. But the upfront costs are real right now and certain. And future outcomes that are to be avoided oftentimes are probabilistic and have long time horizons. They're easily discounted. Also, both issues have differential risks and impacts on different demographics. There are huge social justice elements involved in that, both within countries and across our global community of countries. And the nature of the threats in all cases are unobservable, somewhat unknown. They oftentimes are communicated with complex scientific models that are not always accessible to the general population. And as I alluded to, they have this exponential pace of growth that makes delay of actions quite dangerous. Turns out that sort of, at least initially, people have argued that we might be able to understand action or inaction on climate change better if we look at what people do in response to the coronavirus. because even though the recipe of the pattern of time delays and uncertainty for COVID-19 and climate change are similar, at least with COVID-19, we find out in a matter of 1 or 2 weeks whether or not an action that we did, not wearing our mask, for example, was or wasn't foolish. In the case of climate change, action or inaction, oftentimes the effects of that oftentimes only get revealed decades later. So maybe sort of understanding what people do in the context of COVID could help us understand better how to design choice architecture in ways that are more amenable to sustainability with respect to climate change. So what we have, and we is again my postdoc Sarah Constantino and also Alicia Cooperman, who has since moved to Texas A&M as a professor in assistant professor in political science, and then my senior colleague Bob Cohen in political science at Princeton. But we have a survey in the field that started in April 2020, funded by the National Science Foundation with 6 waves, national representative Americans that basically give us responses on both climate change and COVID. So that we have a variety of theories that we tested with this survey. And one of them had to do with the important role of emotions, of worry, of concern. Getting back to one of those 3 processing modes, emotion-based decisions, and what I have been sort of calling the preeminence of emotions to guide actions. That's oftentimes a necessary condition. And one of the reasons I have argued a while ago that we don't do enough about climate change is that it doesn't worry us. It doesn't elicit this feeling of visceral concern and worry. And so we looked we elicited people's feelings of concern and worry. And we also asked them about their evaluations of the importance to act on both climate change and COVID, climate change in red, COVID in blue. And as you can see, there's a strong correlation for both risks, for both issues between people's expression of worry and concern about those and their judgments of the importance to act. What predicts differences in worry about these 2 issues? Well, clearly political ideology does. This is not a surprise. We know that both of these issues have been highly politicized. And as you can see, for climate change and for COVID, it's the Democrats who are vastly more concerned about the issue than either independents or Republicans at the bottom. And while people are more concerned about COVID than about climate change, the pattern, strong divisions along political ideology hold for that issue as well. Now, also, let me say a word about this feeling of visceral concern, this feeling of dread, the psychological risk dimension that psychologists Slovik and Fischoff and Lichtenstein identified in the 1960s. And yes, indeed, when we elicit these psychological risk dimensions for climate change, or for COVID, this feeling of dread, and compare that answer to that question to people's worry, you see that for all 3 political parties, more dread gives rise to more worry. So very much, this is a visceral response rather than a more rational response. And now the really interesting question is, what about personal experience with either issue? And so when it comes to COVID-19, basically having personal experience of getting sick, you or members of your family getting sick, or having a negative financial repercussions of that. We developed an index for both COVID and for climate change. In the case of climate change, negative experience has to do with extreme weather events, hurricanes, floods, droughts, and how they affect you in terms of health, well-being, and health and financial well-being. And as you can sort of see, the index of negative personal experience strongly predicts worry. In other words, personal experience, adverse experience is a teacher that tells us that this is an issue that we should be concerned about. And now the question is to what extent is that a function of who you are, of whether you're a Republican, Democrat, or an independent? And we had ex ante 2 theories on that. One of them would be that believing is seeing, and that therefore Republicans who don't necessarily want to acknowledge the fact that COVID is a worrisome phenomenon, or climate change is a worrisome phenomenon, because it leads to government intervention and government involvement. Large governments are seen as a non-desirable. And so because of the ideological commitment, they might actually be less likely to be influenced by negative personal experiences. The other hypothesis was that the personal experience for Republicans is more surprising because the ideology and their ideological channels are telling them this is not a serious issue. And yet when they're confronted with personal experience, this is newsworthy. And we know from reinforcement learning models that the more surprising an event is, the more does it lead to updating of your prior beliefs. And this is indeed what we find. It's a second hypothesis that we confirmed. Negative personal experience with climate change is a stronger determinant of worry for Republicans than it is for Democrats or independents. And that's true again for both issues, for climate change on the left and for COVID-19 on the right. So what do we take away from that? Basically, we find that people perceive the 2 issues differently across various psychological risk dimensions. Climate change is seen as less controllable and a greater unknown. COVID elicits greater worry and feelings of dread. And that probably explains why there has been a larger both public and personal willingness to act on COVID-19 than there has been on climate change. Worry is partisan. Democrats are more worried than Republicans. Even after controlling for local incidence rates and demographics and material facts. But at the same time, personal experience with a risk does increase worry about the risk and willingness to take action, even if it involves personal monetary costs. I didn't show you those results, and controlling for political affiliation and other factors. So we do find that personal experience actually has the ability to narrow the partisan divide for both issues. Of course, how much we can narrow that divide for both issues is a function of how much personal experience there is. And you can say it's good in a way that we're not more affected by both of these issues. But if we were, the gap would narrow more. And it's certainly true that for climate change, we have increasingly personal experiences with extreme weather events. It's no longer a distant statistical issue. It has become real. And hopefully, that will also lead to increased political and personal action on that issue. So in terms of general conclusions, I want to end with a couple of metaphors. One metaphor is that to address these behavior and these complex realities and these complex crises in environments that we live in, we have to combine and conquer. Combine and conquer across different disciplines to explain a given phenomenon, like lack of action on climate change or how to increase action on climate change, but also combine and conquer in terms of combining across different issues and crises to understand in a particular psychological phenomenon or moderator or mediator. In other words, we want to create explanatory mosaics, that tell us by contributions from different disciplines and different issues how human action can be shaped in such a way that we can overcome our bounded rationality constraints and make decisions that will reassure us of a future on this planet. So what sort of issues and disciplines do we have to combine? Well, interdisciplinary investigations have been quite successful when we have attempted them in the last few years. It's not always easy to do that. You have to learn different languages, different terminologies, different sets of social norms about how research gets done. What's an interesting question. But cognitive and social psychology have worked much better together in recent years, in part because they had to address these complex social issues like climate change, sustainability. Political science and sociology have added research on social networks. Ecology and climatology sort of clearly tell us what are the physical constraints and processes that intersect with these social processes. And evolutionary biology has told us about the importance of feedback loops, complex adaptive systems. Management science tells us how to put all of these insights to work into developing information systems and decision systems that can reassure that our decisions are foresightful and maybe more in line with rational choice. And then in terms of frameworks and tools, we need causal theories to guide the design of these interventions, these choice architecture interventions I addressed. We need network models from sociology that tell us how the behavior of others or the opinions of others, oftentimes mediated by these social networks that are so prevalent in our everyday life, influence our decisions. Complex adaptive systems models to get at the notion of tipping points and nonlinear effects. Natural experiments when they're sent our way, like COVID-19, to test theories that are very hard to test otherwise. And also to use field and frame field experiments to test theories that might have been successful in the lab, but have not stood the test of being applied in a particular social and physical context, and therefore having to interact with these additional constraints. So let me thank you for your scarce attention. Here's some contact information from me. And at the end, again, the Google website for HubCC crowdsourcing efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Weber, for taking the time to talk with us today. I thought that was excellent, so thank you. And I really enjoyed what you had to say, but it also made me think about how we live our lives in the way that we do, and you touched on that quite a bit within what you were saying as well. But also our roles and what we might do to actually bring about change. So I think that was excellent as well, the way that you kind of pushed us to reflect there. It was great to see that you're working with Sweden on this agenda. That was lovely. And I just wondered what attracted you to working with Sweden and how you found this experience.
It's a question with many answers. And we know, especially in this week of Nobel Prizes, we know that Sweden has a long commitment to highlighting the importance of science and the importance of science and arts, and contributions that we can make, systematic contributions to human well-being. And I think the existence of institutes like the Bear Institute for Ecological Economics, that again does this building of bridges across disciplines so well, and probably better than any other group I've seen, or the Stockholm Resilience Center that really tries to bring together researchers from different perspectives, and not just within sort of their staff, but also from around the world as collaborators. So I think it was really more Sweden reaching out to me, because they are so welcoming to these kinds of collaborations, and realizing that I value these collaborations. So they reached out to me. At the same time, my husband is partly Swedish, and so we have family in Sweden, and so that certainly has helped as well. But it has been really richly rewarding, and especially you mentioned the ASCO meetings, and I was so fortunate to have the first one in person on this lovely island. And so the idea that science can be fun and rewarding, and is a social enterprise, and at the same time, so we have to put the science to work. Just doing it in the ivory tower is not enough. And to really affect social solutions, it has to be done interdisciplinarily. And I think Sweden does that so well.
That's lovely to hear. Thank you for that. And one of the key things that also struck me as you were talking was how we kind of further engage our student communities in these discussions and work together to bring about change. And I don't know if you have any thoughts here.
It's a great point, and I have another talk where I sort of talk about the the take-home message is all hands on deck. That we really need sort of all segments of society to contribute, and that all segments of society have contributions to make. And we oftentimes, and when you say students, sort of that, of course, is a broad range. It sort of starts in elementary school or even probably earlier, and goes up to university and postdoc levels. But I think it's really important to educate young children about these kind of issues, because it's a young generation that has a huge impact on older people. We know, for example, that concern about climate change is very much generational. That the young generation is vastly concerned about it, as well they should, but that older people sort of oftentimes don't care, or either that they don't know or they don't care as much, which is understandable maybe from an evolutionary perspective, but it's not exactly acceptable in a way. But it's grandchildren that change their grandparents' behavior, and you hear this from so many CEOs that actually have become more concerned about environmental responsibility or other social responsibility, that they get that from their grandchildren. But more broadly, I think the message that environmental issues can be studied from all these different perspectives, from the physical sciences, from the social sciences, from the humanities. I mean, I think making us more aware of both sort of the dangers involved, but maybe also more importantly about the solutions that they do exist and can be implemented, and might seem like drops in the bucket. You might want to think that sort of individual contributions, either to the science or individual contributions, sort of to the practice, of more sustainable behavior, don't add up too much, but they do when you multiply them by 9 billion. When you multiply them by the effect, that somebody in a position of responsibility has, and that we have to use all of these roles that we play, whether it's as grandchildren, or as professional decision makers, or as scientists, in a way to contribute to those decisions, to those solutions, and a greater focus maybe on the solution space and what individuals can do in the solution space rather than in the problem space might be a step in the right direction.
Thank you for that. I've got some questions as well coming in from the audience, some more questions. To what extent do you find that people in companies take a more realistic view of people into account, and to what extent do you see regulators doing this?
That's a great question, and there probably is not a single answer to that. But we do know, first of all, I should say, that sort of taking into consideration individual differences when it comes to your customers has become so much easier because of sort of the electronic way in which we interact with customers these days. So it's particular tech companies who probably know more about us than we know about ourselves. There's this huge information they have about us, but they also put that to use. I don't want to say to good use, because it's not always good use, but they put that to use. And I think there's something to be learned from how companies deal with individual differences by A/B testing of any kind of innovation that they want, because psychological theories are complex, and it's not always easy to predict what happens in a given specific social and physical context. I think it's because multiple sort of theories are at play, and it's not always clear which one will win out, which one is seen most important, or in different segments of the population. I think it's really important that we test these interventions and predictions in small samples, and then sort of scale up when we have something that actually sort of works in a given context. But it's not a sort of one size fits all kind of intervention, and I think companies are doing that quite well. Policymakers also are becoming much more aware, I think, of the added value of a better understanding of the full complexity of human responses. And so I mentioned the fifth assessment report in 2014 of the IPCC introduced these non-rational decision modes for the first time. Well, it turns out that the current, in a chapter on risk management, the current version, the sixth assessment report that is sort of being released, the first was released this summer, but the one is adaptation and mitigation is coming out next year. They actually have a standalone chapter in mitigation on demand side solutions. Now, so they realize that there is a huge potential of changing people's behavior. Clearly, human behavior change is not going to solve the problem. We need action, sort of at national, multinational levels, and structural change. But human behavior change can amplify these other interventions in very, very useful ways. And we need that amplification to get where we need to go in terms of constraining global warming to 1.5 degree or even 2 degrees Celsius. And I think policymakers are becoming much more aware of it. Sometimes I'm afraid they're becoming sort of too aware of it, and they're putting too many of their hopes into that one basket because some of the other avenues have been less successful. But I think there's absolutely a sea change in awareness on that issue everywhere.
Thank you for that. And then another question for you. Do you think data-driven decision-making can be useful as part of climate change solutions?
Absolutely. Basically, machine learning, sort of these days, is being used in many different contexts. And I think it's a natural adaptation to having so much data around, because data collection has become so easy and oftentimes it's automated. We can't possibly make use of the full range of data by just sort of running our own analysis. So I think sort of we have to pass it on to the machines to make sense of these patterns. At the same time, I think also we have to figure out how to best combine sort of human oversight of these processes, because with pattern recognition, we see it even with humans. Humans are very good at discerning patterns in sort of large amounts of data, but it oftentimes also leads to superstitious behavior, and seeing patterns where there aren't any. So I think it has an important role to play, and I think sort of the challenge will be how to combine these different tools that the different disciplines bring to the table. And I probably should have added machine learning to my set of disciplines and tools. And I will do that for the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got one more question, but it's quite a long one, and I don't know if we've got enough time, but I'll start it and see how we get on. Do you think there is a need to highlight that it might be okay that there is underlying heterogeneity in the importance of sustainability goals?
Absolutely. I think that it's an important issue. And as somebody who studies climate change, you always sort of think your problem is the most important problem in the world. And of course, that's not true. And the allocation of value and importance weights to different social issues is a social process. It's a process that doesn't have a scientific answer. It's something that has to be hammered out in discussion, in negotiations. And I think it's important that all voices are heard, and all opinions are considered and hopefully integrated, because oftentimes it's the case that when we think about what are all the issues that we ought to consider, different people might have different rank orders, but it turns out that there oftentimes are win-win solutions, where one subset of solutions to my issue might actually be better for you and your focus on another issue. It might not be my best solution, but it might be your best solution. And if you can basically combine or consider all of our objectives and all our goals, then sort of this particular subset that I might not have considered before, now actually is becoming much more attractive to you because it solves your problem as well.
Thank you for that. And I'll stop with the questions there. So sorry if I didn't get everybody's questions in, but unfortunately we're running out of time and we've taken up a lot of your time already. So thank you, Professor Weber. It's been a real honour to hear you talk and reflect on what needs to change. I think it's been so interesting, especially for me and the work that I've been involved in as well.